The walls of the asylum were thick with silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence heavy and suffocating, like the quiet that settles just before a storm crashes through broken windows. For years, the ward had been forgotten by time, its corridors dim and crumbling, paint peeling like dead skin. Night bled endlessly into dawn, but sleep never came, at least not for those who lingered inside. Among them was a man whose eyes betrayed the battle he fought every night. Insomnia was a monster with many faces, and it wore his reflection like a mask, gaunt, hollow, restless. He wandered through narrow hallways, footsteps muted on cracked linoleum, tracing the outlines of memories that had long since faded. His breath was shallow, a slow rhythm against the echoing emptiness. He had no name here, no history that mattered, just the weight of sleepless nights piling upon each other like fallen leaves in a graveyard. His mind twisted into shadows, weaving hallucinations between the lines of reality. Sometimes the walls whispered in static, a faint hum just beyond hearing, a voice that carried secrets wrapped in white noise. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed in sync with his heartbeat, casting long, jittering shadows that danced in corners no one else could see. The other patients were silent figures, drifting like ghosts through endless twilight, their faces blurred in the haze of his weary gaze. But the true visitor came without warning, a flicker of movement, a ripple in the air, an unshaped presence that lurked in the periphery of his vision. It was not a figure of flesh and blood, but a distortion, a glitch in the fabric of his fractured mind. Each night it came closer, bleeding static and whispers into the stale air, unraveling the fragile thread that tethered him to wakefulness. His body trembled beneath a weight no one else could feel. Time folded in on itself, moments looping like a broken record. He would sit in the corner of his cell, the cold seeping through his thin hospital gown, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at a corner that was never empty. The sleepless ward had become a prison not only of stone and steel, but of fractured perception. Reality was a thin veil here, shredded by relentless nights and the visitor that crept ever nearer. The man understood that soon, very soon, the visitor would no longer be content to linger just beyond the edge of sight. It would step into the room, and the last barrier between sanity and oblivion would vanish entirely. The corridor stretched endlessly, as if the asylum itself had become a labyrinth designed to trap time rather than its occupants. The flickering lights overhead stuttered unpredictably, casting distorted shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe with the rhythm of the sleepless. Walls once pristine were now mottled with age, paint peeling away like a skin shedding its secrets, revealing raw plaster beneath, cracked, brittle, and stained. The air hung thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay, mingling in a nauseating perfume that settled deep into the lungs. Every breath the man took was a reminder that life persisted here, but only barely. His body was frail, bones protruding beneath thin skin, stretched taut by months, no years, of relentless wakefulness. His eyes rimmed with raw redness, flicked from one shadow corner to another, desperate to catch any flicker of movement that might explain the creeping presence that haunted him. Sleep had once been a refuge, a balm to pain and fear. But here it was an enemy, a traitor promising rest but delivering only deeper darkness. Nights dragged on interminably, minutes melting into hours with no relief, no dreamscape to escape into. His mind had become a fractured mirror, shards reflecting fragments of memories, some real, some conjured by the incessant hunger of exhaustion. He could no longer tell where the walls ended and his thoughts began. The visitor arrived not with a shout or a physical form, but as a subtle shift in the air, a vibration in the silence, like a needle scratching a record too many times. It came first as a faint static, a low hiss beneath the groan of the asylum's ancient pipes. Then the temperature dropped, a biting chill that wormed into his bones despite the threadbare gown wrapped around his shivering frame. It lingered in the corners of his vision, just beyond clarity, a hazy ripple distorting the edges of reality. The visitor was not flesh nor shadow, but a warped frequency, like a glitch bleeding through the fabric of the waking world. Each night it pressed closer, a creeping presence that gnawed at the thin veil of sanity. His thoughts spiraled, tangled in the noise. He tried to anchor himself in the mundane, the cracked tile beneath his feet, the peeling paint on the walls, but even these tangible details warped and twisted, bending like light through a fractured lens. The asylum itself seemed to pulse with the visitor's rhythm, a living entity feeding off his torment. In the sleepless ward, time fractured, hours folded into one another, memories tangled with hallucinations. Sometimes he saw faces behind the cracked glass of the cell doors, blank, soulless masks staring back at him. Sometimes the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a slow, agonizing rhythm, as if the asylum exhaled its own despair. And always there was the visitor. It did not speak, for words would give it shape and form, but it whispered nonetheless, a static-laced murmur curling at the edges of hearing. Secrets slithered through the haze, promises and threats entwined like smoke. The man could feel it inside him now, a presence that had crossed from the space between thoughts into his very being. His reflection in the cracked mirror was no longer his own. It flickered, distorted by the visitor's touch, a fractured echo of a man lost to himself. His reflection smiled when he did not, eyes black pits swallowing the flicker of humanity that remained. The nights blurred, bleeding into endless days of half-life, his mind a battlefield of fractured thoughts and impossible shapes. He had lost count of how many times he had tried to grasp the visitor, to hold on to something real, but it slipped through his fingers like static on an old television screen. The asylum walls closed in tighter, a coffin built from fear and sleeplessness. Somewhere deep in the heart of this forgotten place, the visitor waited patient, inevitable. And the man knew, without doubt, that soon the visitor would step from the shadows and consume what little remained of his fractured soul. The relentless nights folded into one another without mercy, dragging the man deeper into the asylum's grip. Time had become a meaningless blur, a ceaseless looping of shadows and static whispers. The sterile walls, once symbols of order and care, had transformed into an oppressive labyrinth that twisted perception and unraveled certainty. Every corner held a secret, every creak of rusted pipes a sinister promise. The visitor's presence grew stronger, more insistent. It was no longer content to linger just at the periphery of vision, flickering like a broken signal on a forgotten television set. It began to manifest in more tangible ways, a sudden chill brushing against skin, a low pulsating hum that vibrated in the marrow of his bones, a shimmering distortion that bent the world around him. The asylum itself seemed to warp, its geometry fracturing as if reality was cracking under the weight of unseen forces. Sleep remained an elusive specter. The man's eyes were wide and unblinking, his skin pale and clammy, etched with lines of exhaustion and despair. Dreams, when they came, were cruel phantasms, fragmented memories turned grotesque, rooms folding into themselves, familiar faces melting into unrecognizable masks. Awakening offered no relief, only the cold certainty that the visitor had followed him back into the waking world, seeping into every moment of lucidity. Within the confines of his cell, the man's reflection haunted him. The cracked mirror on the wall no longer showed a faithful image, but a fractured illusion. His eyes stared back with a hollow intensity, pupils dilated into black voids. The visitor's influence was evident in every tremor of the glass, every subtle distortion that turned his face into something both his own and utterly alien. It was as if the mirror was a window into a parallel nightmare, a reflection not of the man, but of the visitor itself. The asylum's silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the man's ragged breath and the distant, indistinct noises of the night shift staff, shadows themselves, as disconnected and spectral as the patients they monitored. But the real noise came from within, a rising tide of static and whispers that threatened to drown reason. The visitor whispered secrets not meant for the living, weaving tendrils of madness into the man's mind. It promised release from the prison of wakefulness, a surrender into oblivion that was both terrifying and tantalizing. The man resisted, clinging to the shards of his identity, but the visitor's pull was inexorable. The asylum's corridors seemed to pulse with a life of their own, breathing with the slow rhythm of a dying heart. Walls warped and stretched, ceilings drooped as if weighed down by invisible hands. The man wandered endlessly, lost in a maze of crumbling plaster and flickering lights, chasing phantoms that dissolved whenever he reached for them. Each night the visitor edged closer, its form more defined, yet no less terrifying a distortion of static and shadow, an echo of something long forgotten and better left unseen. It was the embodiment of insomnia's true horror. Not the absence of sleep, but the collapse of reality itself. And in the suffocating stillness of the sleepless ward, the man understood with chilling clarity that soon the visitor would no longer be content to haunt the edges of his vision. It would consume him utterly, dragging him into the endless static between worlds, where nothing was real and everything was lost. The nights stretched out like endless tunnels, each one darker and colder than the last, swallowed whole by the asylum's oppressive silence. Time itself fractured and splintered, a cracked mirror reflecting a world slipping through the man's grasp. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten pain, saturating his lungs with every shallow breath. Insomnia had become his prison and his tormentor. His body trembled beneath its weight, a fragile vessel eroding with every sleepless hour. His skin, once alive with color, had faded to a pallid ghost, stretched tightly over sharp bones that jutted beneath thin hospital sheets. Eyes sunken and bloodshot, glassy and unblinking, bore witness to the endless struggle between mind and madness. The visitor, that spectral distortion of sound and shadow, no longer confined itself to the periphery. It pulsed in the very fabric of the asylum, a living static that warped reality like heat on cracked asphalt. Walls breathed with slow, agonizing rhythm, their cracked paint shifting as if they too were alive, twitching, exhaling decay. The ceiling above sagged in grotesque waves, peeling layers hanging like rotten flesh. He felt it crawling beneath his skin, a faint vibration that resonated through bone and nerve. The static's cold fingers tracing patterns of terror deep within. Each flicker of the failing fluorescent lights cast unnatural shadows that stretched and recoiled, as if the walls themselves were writhing entities in silent agony. The visitor's presence was a sick pulse at the edge of perception, threatening to burst forth into full, overwhelming terror. His mind, already fractured by months, no, years of deprivation, spun deeper into a labyrinth of delusion. Thoughts tangled and twisted, memories bleeding into nightmares. He saw the faces of those who had come before him, their eyes hollow voids trapped behind bars of forgetfulness. He could feel them reaching, whispering through the static, their voices a susurrus that teased the edges of sanity. The mirror in his cell was no longer a simple reflector, but a portal of fractured pain through which the visitor stared back, distorting his reflection into a grotesque mockery of self. The man's image flickered, shifting with every heartbeat, a twisted smile, eyes void of humanity, flesh stretched thin and cracked like dry earth. Sometimes the mirror showed things not present in the room, shadowy figures lurking behind, impossible distortions of space and form that dissolved whenever he blinked. Each breath he took was shallow and ragged, a desperate grasp for reality slipping ever further away. The visitor's whispers threaded through his mind like poisonous silk, weaving dark promises that tangled deeper with every passing hour. It spoke not in words, but in unbearable sensation, the ache of endless night, the crushing weight of solitude, the creeping certainty that escape was impossible. In the endless twilight of the sleepless ward, reality became malleable, bending under the visitor's relentless pressure. Floors seemed to ripple beneath his feet, walls stretched and contracted like lungs struggling to breathe. The asylum itself was a living nightmare, a vast, decaying organism feeding on broken minds and shattered souls. He wandered the halls endlessly, his footsteps hollow echoes swallowed by the vast silence. No one came for him, no doctors, no nurses, only the slow, inexorable approach of the visitor. Its form remained elusive, a shifting blur of static and shadow, but its presence was unmistakable. It was the embodiment of every sleepless night, every whispered fear, every fragment of identity eroding into the abyss. The man knew what awaited him. The visitor would not remain a ghost at the edge of his vision for much longer. It would step forward from the haze, enveloping him in its cold, static embrace. And when it did, the fragile boundary between wakefulness and oblivion would shatter, leaving only endless, unyielding darkness. Days and nights collapsed into one indistinguishable expanse. The man's body, long since abandoned by the gentle mercy of sleep, trembled with exhaustion, yet refused to surrender. His skin was drawn so tight across his gaunt frame that every breath was a sharp reminder of his vulnerability. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a maddening rhythm, their uneven pulse syncing with the relentless thrum of static that permeated the ward. The visitor no longer merely haunted the edges of perception. It was a presence that pressed in on all sides, a suffocating force that warped the asylum's decaying walls and the fragile contours of his mind. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, its length distorting as if the building itself breathed with a grotesque life. Floor tiles cracked and buckled, curling like dead leaves, while the paint on the walls peeled in wide strips, revealing layers of decay beneath. Shadows pooled unnaturally deep in every corner, thick as ink, swallowing the weak light. Inside his skull, the visitor's voice was no longer a whisper but a pulse, a relentless static that scrambled thoughts, unraveling memories until nothing felt real. The past dissolved into a maelstrom of fractured images and sounds. Distant laughter twisted into malicious jeers, faces melting into grotesque masks, fleeting moments snatched away before they could be grasped. His reflection in the cracked mirror mocked him mercilessly. It was no longer merely a reflection, but a fractured, shifting image, a portal into the visitor's realm. His eyes stared back, black and hollow, flickering with a life of their own. The mouth twisted into impossible expressions. Sometimes a smile too wide, other times a scream frozen in time. It was a visage that belonged neither to him nor any human, but to the visitor itself, a living nightmare imprisoned in glass. The visitor's touch crept across his skin like a slow, icy current, slipping beneath the thin hospital gown and settling deep into muscle and bone. It was an invasive presence, erasing boundaries between self and other, collapsing the fragile barrier between reality and hallucination. The asylum's walls seemed to pulse with the visitor's rhythm, breathing in a slow, agonizing cadence, as if the building itself were a vessel for something monstrous and ancient. Tomorrow? Sounds twisted into grotesque symphonies. The distant drip of water echoed like a pounding heartbeat. The creak of old pipes groaned in low, tortured moans, and somewhere far away, an unseen door slammed shut with finality. The man moved through this haunted maze, each step a battle against the creeping madness that sought to consume him whole. Sleep remained forever out of reach. The visitor had claimed that sanctuary, turning dreams into distorted prisons, where time folded and twisted like smoke. In those brief, tortured moments of unconsciousness, he was trapped in endless labyrinths of his own mind, pursued by shadows that whispered of oblivion and loss. Each awakening was a fresh wound, a brutal reminder that the visitor waited patiently in the darkness, gathering strength. It was no longer content to merely haunt it, sought to devour, to drag the man from the crumbling remnants of his fractured mind into the endless void between waking and dreaming. The visitor's form began to coalesce, no longer a mere flicker or static haze, but a tangible presence that bent light and sound, a shifting mass of shadow and broken signal. It hovered close, a cold breath against the man's fevered skin, a promise of dissolution. In that suffocating stillness, with the walls closing in and the visitor pressing ever closer, the man understood with a terrifying clarity. Resistance was futile. Soon he would slip beneath the surface of reality, swallowed by the visitor's unyielding silence, lost forever in the static between worlds. The line between the man's mind and the asylum blurred to nothingness. Reality became a fragile illusion, fractured and brittle beneath the visitor's relentless assault. His thoughts fractured into shards of incoherence, scattering in the static that now dominated his senses. Time dilated, minutes stretched into hours, hours collapsed into seconds, until past, present, and future were inseparable and meaningless. The visitor's presence was all-consuming. It seeped into the very air, thickening it until each breath was a struggle, heavy and leaden in his lungs. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a malevolent heartbeat, throbbing in sync with the visitor's dark rhythm. His feet felt tethered to the cold floor, yet at the same time his body was weightless, drifting on a sea of endless noise. In this warped reality, the asylum's endless corridors curled back upon themselves, turning into impossible geometries. Doors opened onto ceilings, staircases descended into blank walls, and windows showed infinite voids where the outside world should have been. The visitor whispered through every crack and crevice, a static-laced voice that scratched at his sanity, promising oblivion and release from the torment of wakefulness. His reflections shattered once more. The mirror cracked and splintered, fracturing his face into dozens of distorted pieces, each fragment showing a different nightmare. One eye bulged grotesquely, another dripped with dark, inky tears. His mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin that split his cheeks, exposing rows of too many teeth. The visitor's shadowy shape flickered behind him, shifting and folding into impossible angles. Sleep had become a cruel stranger. The visitor invaded his dreams with a relentless grip, twisting them into endless spirals of dread. He ran through endless mazes, walls closing in with suffocating speed, voices whispering unintelligible warnings just beyond reach. Every attempt to rest was met with the visitor's cold, invasive touch, dragging him back into the waking nightmare. His thoughts were no longer his own. Memories surfaced only to dissolve instantly, replaced by static-filled fragments of unknown origin. The man's identity unraveled thread by thread, a tapestry fraying at the edges under the visitor's merciless hands. He could no longer trust his senses. The visitor corrupted every sensation, turning light into shadow, warmth into ice, sound into unbearable noise. The asylum's silence was absolute except for the ever-present hum of static that filled his ears, a buzzing that never ceased, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his bones. It was the visitor's voice, a song of madness and despair, drawing him closer to the edge of oblivion. As the visitor's form solidified further, the man felt it pressing against his very soul, a black void that consumed light and hope. It promised release, but at the cost of everything that made him human. The visitor was no longer content to haunt. It sought to become one with him, to erase the boundaries of self and shadow, to dissolve him into the endless static that lay between worlds. The man stood at the threshold of madness, the visitor's cold breath on his neck, the abyss beckoning with open arms. And in that final moment, with his identity crumbling and the asylum itself twisting into a nightmare labyrinth, he knew there was no turning back. The walls no longer offered comfort or protection. They closed in, warped and breathing, as though the asylum itself was a living thing intent on swallowing him whole. Each step he took echoed endlessly in the empty halls, a hollow drum beat marking his slow unraveling. His breath came in shallow gasps, the very act of breathing a laborious effort weighed down by the suffocating air thick with dust, despair, and decay. Sleep was a distant memory, a broken shard of time long lost to the relentless march of endless nights. His eyes, bloodshot and unblinking, scanned the shadows for the visitor, the ever-present static that slithered just beyond sight, a malicious whisper scraping at the edges of his mind. The visitor was no longer a ghost, but a malignant force, twisting the very fabric of his thoughts, reshaping his perceptions into a nightmarish maze with no exit. He found himself wandering in circles, the asylum's corridors folding over themselves in impossible angles, a cruel trick of his fracturing mind. The ceiling sagged low, dripping with grimy condensation that tasted like rust and rot. Flickering lights cast elongated, twitching shadows that moved independently, weaving patterns of dread that burrowed deep into his consciousness. The visitor's voice was a low, buzzing drone, an incessant static that gnawed at the edges of his sanity, promising release even as it tightened its grip. Memories surfaced like fragmented photographs, each one warped and smeared with dark stains. Faces of forgotten friends and family blurred into grotesque masks, their eyes empty voids staring into his soul. Moments of happiness twisted into scenes of despair, laughter warped into screams that echoed down the empty halls. His own reflection fractured in the shards of a broken mirror, a distorted visage staring back with hollow eyes, a cracked mouth frozen in a silent scream, i.e., he tried to anchor himself, grasping at remnants of his identity that slipped away like smoke through trembling fingers. But the visitor's presence seeped into every crevice, infecting his thoughts with doubt and fear. He questioned what was real. Was the asylum a prison or a labyrinth of his own mind? Was the visitor a specter conjured by his sleepless torment, or a malevolent entity waiting to consume his soul? The asylum responded to his fear. Floors rippled like liquid beneath his feet. Walls pulsed with a heartbeat that matched his own ragged pulse. Doors appeared where none had been before, opening onto endless voids or impossibly narrow passageways that seemed to collapse in on themselves. The visitor's touch was a cold, insistent pressure beneath his skin, a creeping numbness that spread like frostbite through his limbs. Voices whispered from the darkness, distant yet intimately close, threading through the static that filled his ears. They spoke in riddles and half-remembered phrases, promising salvation or damnation, comfort or oblivion. Each whisper was a dagger, slicing deeper into the fragile veil of his mind. He trembled, caught in a web of fear and despair, woven by the visitor's relentless presence. His footsteps faltered, and he collapsed to the cold floor, the visitor's static buzzing louder, drowning out all other sounds. The world tilted and swayed, colors bleeding from the walls, and the shadows drew nearer, thickening like living ink. He felt himself pulled toward the visitor, a dark vortex of nothingness that promised eternal silence. In that moment, the last thread of resistance snapped. The man was no longer a prisoner of the asylum alone. He was a captive of the visitor, lost in the static abyss where time unraveled and identity dissolved. His mind shattered like glass under the weight of the endless night, and the visitor's cold embrace closed around him, consuming all light, all hope. The asylum's breath was slow and deliberate now. A pulse felt beneath the cracked floorboards, reverberating through the man's very bones. The visitor's presence had shifted from a whisper to a roar, a suffocating wave of static and shadow that pressed against every fragment of his being. The walls, once cracked and crumbling, now writhed with a grotesque vitality, pulsating as if they were vessels for something ancient and malevolent. Corridors stretched into impossible dimensions, folding like paper in a maddening origami of despair. The ceiling dripped with thick, tar-like droplets that hissed softly when they struck the floor, the sound echoing endlessly. Faint, distant screams drifted through the air at once distant yet achingly close, a haunting lullaby to the man's unraveling sanity. His footsteps no longer followed the asylum's layout, but traced patterns only he could see, spirals that led nowhere, looping endlessly through infinite hallways that bent and twisted like the coils of a serpent. Light bled from the flickering bulbs, casting sickly hues of green and yellow that distorted the familiar into the grotesque. The visitor's static crawled beneath his skin, 1,000 tiny needles tracing icy paths down his spine. His thoughts fractured further, splintering into shards of paranoia and terror. Faces emerged from the walls, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes wells of despair that threatened to drown him in their darkness. He reached a door once plain, now adorned with ancient, indecipherable symbols that pulsed with an eerie glow. Beyond it lay a room bathed in shadows thicker than any night, where the visitor's voice became a tangible force, wrapping around him like chains forged from forgotten nightmares. Inside, the air was dense and heavy, as if the room itself exhaled despair. The floor beneath him felt liquid, shifting beneath his weight like quicksand, pulling him deeper into oblivion. The visitor revealed itself here not as a shape or figure, but as a suffocating presence that bent reality, a rift in the fragile membrane separating sanity from madness. The man felt his mind stretch and tear, memories and identity slipping like water through cupped hands. The asylum was no longer a building, but a labyrinthine prison within his own psyche, constructed by the visitor's insidious will. Escape was an illusion, a cruel joke played by the darkness that now consumed his every thought. Time ceased to exist. Moments bled into one another, a ceaseless void where the visitor's static became the only constant. The man was caught in a spiral, falling endlessly into the abyss of his own fractured mind, where the visitor waited patiently, a patient predator stalking the shadows of his soul. The asylum no longer resembled any place tethered to the waking world. It had become a living organism, breathing slow and heavy. Its pulse felt deep within the cracked floors, vibrating like a funeral drum against his ribcage. The visitor's presence was no longer a whisper or a faint static. It had grown into a monstrous, suffocating roar that filled every corner of his consciousness. The oppressive sound pressed in through his ears and settled beneath his skin. A crawling, icy chill that froze his blood and burrowed into his bones. The walls were no longer stable barriers, but quivering flesh, thick veins pulsing beneath cracked plaster. They undulated rhythmically, as if the asylum itself were a slumbering beast disturbed from a long nightmare. Black streaks oozed like ink from the fissures, pooling in the corners, swallowing the peeling paint and rusted metal fixtures with an insatiable hunger. The corridors had abandoned all logic and geometry. Hallways stretched and contracted unpredictably, elongating into impossible tunnels that looped back on themselves. Doorways appeared and vanished without warning, leading to endless spirals of darkness, where the faintest glow was swallowed whole. The ceiling drooped low in some places, dripping viscous, tar-like droplets that hissed quietly as they hit the floor, each sound echoing infinitely through the endless, warped halls. Through this madness, faint echoes of sound drifted, distant but unmistakable. A woman's agonized scream, sharp and brittle, reverberated off the walls before dissolving into static. The laughter of children, warped and twisted into grotesque parodies, flickered like ghostly specters on the edges of his vision. Whispers floated through the air, not voices of reason, but disjointed fragments of forgotten language, impossible to grasp, yet filled with an ancient, malignant intent. His steps became unsteady, as though the floor beneath him were alive and breathing, trying to pull him under like quicksand. Every movement sent ripples through the stale air, distorting space and time around him. The flickering lights overhead bled their sickly, jaundiced glow, casting unnatural shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls. The shadows were no longer mere absences of light. They had gained a sinister life of their own, crawling, stretching, and recoiling as if they were sentient entities observing his descent. The visitor's static crawled under his skin like 1,000 ice-cold needles, relentless and inescapable. His thoughts splintered under the pressure, fracturing into shards of dread and confusion. Faces appeared in the walls, their features melting and warping in an endless agony, mouths stretched impossibly wide in silent screams, eyes hollow voids that drank in his terror. He was trapped within a gallery of horrors, each apparition a reflection of his fractured psyche. He came upon a door unlike any other. Where once the asylum's architecture had been sterile and institutional, this portal was adorned with symbols, ancient, undecipherable glyphs carved deep into blackened wood. They pulsed faintly with a sickly green light, as though the door itself was a living thing, breathing dark secrets from beyond human understanding. The air grew heavier as he approached. It pressed down on him like an iron weight, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Beyond the threshold lay a room swallowed by darkness, not simply the absence of light, but a thick, viscous shadow that seemed to cling to his skin and seep into his lungs. The visitor's voice emerged here as a physical presence, a cold fog wrapping around him with crushing force, whispering promises of release and oblivion in a language older than time. The floor beneath him lost solidity, becoming a viscous liquid that sucked at his feet, pulling him downward. He felt himself slipping into an abyssal quicksand, drawn ever deeper into the visitor's realm, where the boundary between mind and nightmare dissolved. His identity frayed, memories slipping like water through trembling fingers, eroded by the visitor's relentless assault. The asylum was no longer a place but a labyrinth of his own fractured psyche, a twisted funhouse constructed by the visitor's dark will. Escape was an illusion, a cruel mockery in the face of the ever-tightening spiral of madness. Time fragmented into shards, moments bleeding into one another without rhythm or reason. The visitor's static became the only constant in the void, a dreadful, ceaseless drone that gnawed at his mind and soul. He spiraled endlessly into the abyss, a captive prey to the visitor's malevolent will, lost in the depths of his own collapsing reality. The asylum's walls had ceased being mere boundaries. They were now oppressive sentinels, watching his every fracturing thought. The air was thick, almost viscous, saturating his lungs with a foul heaviness that dulled his senses but heightened his terror. Every breath felt like inhaling the rot of forgotten souls trapped within these cursed halls. His mind had become a fragile glass, shattered into countless jagged pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted reality. Time warped unpredictably. Minutes stretched into hours, then snapped back with dizzying speed. Memories, once comforting anchors, dissolved into shadows. Faces of loved ones blurred into grotesque masks, their eyes hollow pits that stared without recognition. The visitor's static no longer simply invaded his ears. It enveloped him, a suffocating cocoon of sound and darkness. It whispered secrets too terrible to comprehend, weaving threads of despair that constricted around his heart like a vice. His heartbeat was drowned beneath the relentless drone, each pulse a reminder of his fading humanity. He stumbled through the labyrinthine asylum, corridors folding into impossible geometries that defied logic. Walls breathed expanding and contracting like the lungs of some monstrous beast, their surfaces slick with a black ichor that shimmered under the jaundiced flicker of failing lights. The floor beneath him felt less solid with every step, as if he tread upon the surface of a boiling abyss. Shadows darted just beyond his peripheral vision, teasing and taunting, shapes with no form but intent. They whispered his name in fractured tones, voices that echoed from the void within his mind. The visitor was no longer a distant torment, but an intimate parasite feeding on his sanity, rewriting his thoughts with every pulsating wave of static. He reached out, grasping at the intangible, desperate for something real, something stable. His fingers closed around cold, clammy air as the asylum's reality melted around him. Walls stretched and curved like melting wax, and ceilings collapsed inward, suffocating him in their descent. The visitor's presence pressed down like a weight of infinite darkness, threatening to consume the last flicker of light within. In that void, his identity began to unravel completely. Names, memories, even the sensation of self slipped through his grasp. He was no longer a man but a hollow vessel, an echo trapped in the static's unending chorus. The asylum had become not a place, but a state of mind, a prison built from fear, insomnia, and the relentless invasion of the visitor. And in that eternal night, where light and hope were but distant myths, the visitor waited patient, unyielding, eternal, ready to claim him as its own. The world outside the asylum had long since faded, a distant echo swallowed by the oppressive blackness that now defined his existence. Time was meaningless here. Each breath felt like inhaling shadows, thick and suffocating, crawling into his lungs and settling like poison. The visitor's static pulsated relentlessly, an unyielding hum that vibrated through his skull, burrowing deeper with every heartbeat. The halls twisted into grotesque shapes, corridors folding over themselves like a malignant tumor consuming sanity. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting with a slow, terrible rhythm, their surfaces slick with a black ichor that gleamed under the jaundiced flicker of dying lights. The floor beneath him was no longer solid. It rippled like liquid beneath his trembling feet, threatening to swallow him whole. Shadows moved just beyond his sight, blurred forms that flickered like broken film, hinting at something inhuman, something ancient and hungry. The visitor's voice was a low, insidious murmur, threading into his thoughts and twisting them like a serpent coiling tighter and tighter. It promised release and oblivion, a final peace beyond the fractured edge of his mind. His own memories betrayed him, slipping through his fingers like smoke. Faces of loved ones became grotesque masks. Voices warped into unintelligible cries that echoed endlessly. He reached out to grasp a fleeting moment of clarity, but it dissolved instantly, leaving only a cold void in its place. The asylum was no longer a building but a living nightmare, a prison of his own shattered psyche. Escape was an illusion. Each door opened into another corridor of despair. Each step led him further from reality. The visitor's static was a constant presence, a dark tide pulling him beneath the waves of madness. His mind fractured into countless pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted fragment of the truth. He was lost, adrift in a sea of shadows, a ghost trapped in the labyrinth of his own unraveling sanity. And in the deepest darkness, the visitor waited patiently, its hunger unending, its silence more terrifying than any scream. The asylum had become a cavern of shadows, its silence punctuated only by the low hum of the visitor's static, a sound that no longer seemed external but part of his very being. The air was thick with decay, every breath a struggle against the choking weight of forgotten sorrows and unspeakable secrets that clung to the walls like damp moss. The floor beneath him shifted subtly, as if the building itself were alive, breathing with a slow, deliberate pulse that matched the pounding of his heart. Time had warped. Hours and days melted together into a timeless void where memories bled into nightmares, and the present moment was a fractured reflection seen through a cracked lens. Faces from his past emerged from the gloom, distorted and silent, their eyes hollow wells of despair that stared unblinking into his soul. They whispered accusations in a language he could not understand, but felt in his bones, a litany of guilt and loss that gnawed relentlessly at his sanity. His footsteps echoed through endless corridors that twisted impossibly, folding back on themselves like the coils of a serpent. Each door he passed was a gateway to another nightmare, rooms filled with suffocating darkness, ceilings that dripped with unseen fluids, and floors that seemed to breathe beneath his feet. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, fleeting, insubstantial, yet charged with a malevolent intent that set his nerves ablaze. The visitor's presence had become a living thing inside him, a parasite feeding on his thoughts, twisting them into grotesque shapes. It whispered secrets of oblivion and release, promising the end of his torment if only he would surrender. But surrender was impossible. The visitor was not a mere intruder, but a part of the asylum's ancient, unfathomable will, an endless echo of madness that had claimed countless souls before him. In this collapsing reality, identity dissolved. He no longer knew his name, his purpose, or even his own face reflected in the shards of broken mirrors that littered the halls. His mind fractured into a kaleidoscope of fears and regrets, each fragment sharper and more painful than the last. The asylum's walls closed in around him, the static's drone rising to a deafening crescendo that drowned out even his own desperate heartbeat. And yet, in that overwhelming darkness, a sliver of something else flickered, a fragile ember of resistance. A question: was this descent endless, or could the asylum's nightmare be undone? Could the visitor, the static, and the shadows be confronted, face down and silenced? The answer lay somewhere deeper in the labyrinth, waiting for him to find it. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolence, closing in as if the asylum itself breathed in sync with his ragged breaths. The visitor's static swelled into a crushing roar that reverberated through his skull, drowning all reason, all hope. His footsteps faltered, dragging him deeper into the suffocating labyrinth, where shadows curled like living things, whispering secrets older than time. His vision blurred, reality bent and fractured. Mirrors lining the hallways shattered spontaneously, their shards reflecting impossible versions of himself, faces twisted in terror, grief, and madness. Each reflection seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of the self slipping away. A voice not the visitor's, but his own trembled within the chaos. This is not the end. You are more than the static. But the words were weak, drowned beneath the crushing weight of the asylum's darkness. He found himself in a chamber unlike the others. Vast, empty, lit only by a single flickering bulb that cast more shadows than light. At the center, a mirror stood, an ancient, ornate relic, its surface swirling like a pool of ink. The visitor's static was thick here, almost tactile, like a living fog that seeped into his skin. Driven by a desperate flicker of defiance, he stepped forward and stared into the mirror. His reflection dissolved and reformed first as the man he once was, then as the broken vessel he had become, and finally as a swirling mass of darkness and static. In that endless swirling, he glimpsed the visitor's true form. Not a shape but a void, an absence so vast it swallowed light and sanity alike. It was the asylum itself, the eternal hunger of forgotten madness, the prison of countless lost souls trapped in endless insomnia. His mind screamed, fracturing further as the static threatened to consume him utterly. But deep within, that ember of resistance sparked into a blaze. He grasped at it, pulling with every shred of will, every fragment of forgotten memory. The mirror cracked, a jagged fissure that spread like wildfire. Light burst through the darkness, searing and pure. The visitor's roar faltered, drowned beneath the tide of clarity. With one final surge, he shattered the mirror completely. The static exploded into silence. The asylum trembled and began to collapse, walls crumbling, shadows fleeing like frightened beasts. He stumbled out into the cold dawn, the first rays of light burning away the remnants of night. He was broken, battered, but alive. And for the first time in endless days, sleep, true, peaceful sleep finally came.